Welcome back to our channel for Sherlock Holmes series written by author Conan Doyle. The Creeping Man. It was a Sunday evening in the beginning of September 1903. I received one of those typical Sherlock Holmes urgent messages. Come at once, SH. I arrived at Baker Street to discover him seated in his favorite armchair, smoking his pipe and deep in thought. It was apparent that Holmes was in the midst of a serious problem. He waved me to a chair. Welcome, dear Watson, he said. I am involved in a rather curious case. I have just one question. Why does Professor Perspiry's wolfhound, Roy, attempt to bite him? I fell into my chair, greatly disappointed. Had I been summoned to answer such a trivial question, leaving behind all my work? Ah, the same old Watson, Holmes declared. You will never learn that the biggest issues are dependent upon the smallest one. But tell me, have you not heard of the famous Camford pathologist, Presbury? Why do you think he was bitten twice by his loyal dog? The dog is ill, I stated. That cannot be ruled out, Holmes replied. But why does he attack no one else except his master then? Also, he bites his master only on select occasions. There was a sudden movement on the stairs, followed by a sharp rap on the door. The new client announced his arrival a moment later, and he was a tall, good-looking youth approximately 30 years old. He was well-dressed and graceful. After shaking hands with Holmes, he cast me a look of surprise. The matter is extremely delicate, Mr. Holmes, he stated. Do not fear, Mr. Bennet, Holmes said in assurance. Dr. Watson is my trusted associate and also a discreet man. As you say, Mr. Holmes, Bennet replied. You understand why I said so, I'm sure. Holmes introduced me to Mr. Trevor Bennet as a man who was the professional assistant to the great scientist and also the fiancé of his only daughter. Is Dr. Watson aware of the situation, Mr. Holmes? Bennet asked. I will brief him now, Holmes replied. Watson, the professor, is famous in Europe and his entire life has been devoted to academics. There has not been any scandal and he is a widower with a daughter named Edith. But a few months ago, his life turned upside down when he was engaged to the daughter of Professor Murphy, his colleague. He was devoted to Alice Murphy, who is a perfect girl. This was a youthful love, perhaps, but the professor's own family did not approve of this much. It was rather excessive, Bennet stated. It was also unnatural and a bit violent, Holmes added. Professor Presbury was a rich man and the girl's father had no objection to this match. The daughter, however, thought that age was a barrier as other suitors were asking for her hand in marriage. But she did like the professor despite his strange ways. Then a rather mysterious thing took place. The professor did something that he had never done before. He left home suddenly without informing anyone where he was going. He returned after a fortnight but did not disclose where he had been. The family only came to know where he had been when they received a letter from a fellow student in Prague. The letter stated how happy the student had been to see the Professor Perspiry there. But after that moment, a strange transformation came over the professor. He became extremely secretive, and everyone who knew him agreed that he was not the same person as before. His genius was unaffected, of course, and his lectures were still brilliant, but there was always something new that was both unpredictable and dangerous. Now, Mr. Bennet, will you be kind enough to disclose the incident of the letters? Holmes requested. The professor had no secrets from me, Mr. Watson, Bennet explained. I was like the son he had never had. I handled all the papers that were addressed to him. I also opened and subdivided his letters, but everything changed after he returned from the secret trip. He informed me that some letters might arrive from London that would be characterized by a cross under the stamp. These were to be strictly for his eyes only. I don't know if he answered these letters that did arrive, as they did not pass through my hands or the family letter basket. The box? Holmes stated. Yes, the box, Bennet said quickly. The professor had brought back a small box from the strip which had quaint German carvings on it. He locked this box in his cupboard and wouldn't let anyone touch it. He was very angry with me once when I touched this box accidentally. This incident took place on July 2nd, Bennet stated after consulting his diary. You are a great witness, Holmes complimented Bennet. I might have use for some of those dates that you have noted down. My great mentor taught me method among other great things, Mr. Holmes, Bennet replied. But on that very day, the 2nd of July, Roy attacked the professor as he came into the hall from his study. July 11th and July 20th saw a repetition of the same scene, and then we had no option but to banish Roy to the stables. It was a shame, as he was a loving animal. Most peculiar indeed, Holmes commented. I was not aware of these details, Mr. Bennet. These are fresh developments. Bennet's face darkened instantly. What I'm talking about happened the night before last, on September 4th, he clarified. It was 2 in the morning, and I was still awake in bed. I heard a dry, muffled sound in the passage and opened the door partly to steal a look. The professor sleeps at the end of the passage and has to pass my room to reach the staircase, but what I saw astonished me. In the faint light of passage, I saw the professor crawling on the floor on his hands and feet with his face between his hands. But he was moving easily despite the awkward position. I was so stunned at the sight that I offered to help him only when he had reached my door. His answer was strange indeed. He jumped up to mutter angry words at me, then he rushed past me and down the staircase. It's a curious case indeed, Holmes commented. What do you say, Watson? As a medical man, I think it requires the assistance of a psychiatrist, I opined. The old gentleman has probably been disturbed by the love affair and has lost his mental balance. His trip abroad might have been to forget this incident, and the box and letters might be indicative of a private transaction. This could be a loan, or it might be that the box contains share certificates. No, Watson, Holmes insisted. I am sure that there is more to it than meets the eye. The door swung open just then as a young lady ran into the room. Mr. Bennet jumped up with a cry as she entered. Edith, dear, what is the matter? He exclaimed. The girl was bright and beautiful. Oh, Jack, she said, it's so scary to be there all alone. I'm awfully frightened. Mr. Holmes, this is my fiancée. Bennet introduced Edith. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Presbury, Holmes stated with a smile. I understand that there is some fresh development in the case. Edith sat down beside Bennet. It happened last night, Mr. Holmes, she began. He had been acting weird all day. I am positive that he does not remember anything that he does later. It was as if he lives in a strange dream. Yesterday was no different. What happened? Holmes inquired. The dog's furious barking woke me up in the night. My room is on second floor and the blinds in my window were up. Thanks to the bright moonlight outside, I was stunned to see my father's face staring at me outside the window. I almost fainted in shock and terror. His face was pressed against the window pane, and one hand was raised as if to push up the window. I almost went mad as I was rooted to the spot for 20 seconds and stared at the face. Then it disappeared, but I was so scared that I could not get out of the bed. I lay there shivering till morning. He did not say anything about the incident at breakfast, and neither did I. I just made up an excuse for coming to town, and here I am. Holmes was very much surprised when Miss Presbury had finished narrating her story. My dear young lady, you stated that your room is on second floor. Tell me, is there a long ladder in the garden? No, Mr. Holmes, she replied. That is the most surprising part. He had no possible means of reaching my window, yet he was there. Holmes requested Mr. Bennet to leave behind his notebook so that he could study the dates. Then he addressed me. I think our line of action is perfectly clear, Watson. According to the young lady, her father recalls little or nothing that happens on certain dates. Let us then call upon him tomorrow, pretending that he had given us an appointment to meet him. He will actually think that he had and had forgotten all about it. This will give us a perfect opportunity to get a closer look at the man and analyze him better. That is an excellent plan, Mr. Bennet stated, but I must warn you that the professor is violent at times. Circumstances demand that we meet him at once. Holmes smiled and replied. Monday morning saw us arrive at the great university town and reach the professor's house. It was a beautiful house that stood in a big lawn. We were aware of someone with a grey head watching us through large horn glasses from the front window. A moment later, we met the mysterious scientist. He was round, tall, and possessed large features. His eyes were keen, sharp, and clever. Please take a seat, gentlemen, he said after inspecting our cards. Now, what can I do for you? That was precisely the question I was about to ask you, Professor. Holmes smiled and stated, I heard that Professor Presbury of Camford was indeed of my services. Indeed? The professor smiled as there was an evil sparkle in those sharp grey eyes. You heard that, did you? And whom did you hear that from? I'm sorry, Professor, Holmes replied, but that is confidential. Do you have a letter or telegram to confirm? The professor inquired. No. The professor rudely said that he would find out for us and walked across the room to ring a bell. Mr. Bennet arrived and the professor asked him if someone called Holmes had an appointment with him. No, sir, Bennet replied with a flush. The professor glared at Holmes. Now, sir, he said, it appears that your position here is rather questionable. Maybe we have made a mistake, Holmes replied, shrugging his shoulder. No, Mr. Holmes, the professor screamed in a high-pitched voice. He stepped between us and the door as he shook his fist angrily at us as we tried to leave. You cannot get out of this as easily as that, he stated as his face contorted in grin of senseless rage. We somehow managed to evade him and run out of the door. Our learned friend's nerves seem out of control, Holmes commented as he ran. Hurry, Watson, as he's still pursuing us. But the feet that ran behind us did not belong to Professor. It was his assistant. I'm so sorry, Mr. Holmes. Bennet apologized. There is no need for an apology, dear sir, Holmes stated. I have never seen him in such a violent mood, Bennet declared. You must understand why Edith and I were so worried. Yet his mind appears to be perfectly clear. Yes, Holmes replied. His memory is much sharper than I had perceived it to be. I had another thing to share with you, Mr. Holmes, Bennet stated as he fished out a piece of paper. I have with me the address of the man in London the professor writes to. It appears he wrote to him in morning. I got it from his blotting paper. Holmes cast a quick glance at the paper and put it in his pocket. Dvorak, he stated. A curious name. It's a vital link. Well, we shall return to London this afternoon, Mr. Bennet. We'll meet you here next Tuesday again. Holmes stopped at a post office on our way and dispatched a telegram. We received the reply that very evening. Have visited the commercial road and seen Dvorak. Saw elderly gentleman keeping large general store. Mercer. Mercer is my informer, Holmes explained. Now let's take the dates first, he said as he rubbed his hands. Young man's diary indicates that there was trouble on the 2nd of July and then it was repeated at 9-day interval, so it occurred again on August 26 and 3rd of September. I agreed. The theory that can be formed, therefore, is that every 9 days the professor takes a drug that has a passing but deadly effect. He got addicted to this drug while in Prague, and now someone from London supplies him with this drug, Holmes concluded. But what about the incident with the dog, the face at the window, and the creeping man? I inquired. Let's meet here next Tuesday to see what happens, Watson. Tuesday saw us board the train to Camford again, and we were received at the station by Mr. Bennet. He informed us that the professor had received a letter and a small packet from his London contact that morning. I think we shall arrive at a conclusion tonight, Holmes declared and instructed Mr. Bennet to remain awake and watchful that night. Do not interrupt the professor if you see him passing by your door, Holmes warned. Follow him as quietly as possible. Watson and I shall be close. We took our positions at the professor's garden at midnight. If the theory of mine day cycle is correct, the professor shall be at his worst mood tonight, Holmes stated. Suddenly the hall door opened and Professor Presbury exited. He was in his dressing gown and standing erect, although leaning forward with dangling arms. But as he stepped forward into the drive, an extraordinary change came over him. He slumped down into a crouching position and moved along upon his hands and feet. He moved around the corner, skipping occasionally. Bennet slipped through the hall door to follow him silently as he disappeared around the bend. We saw the professor ascend the ivy-covered wall, springing from the branch to branch. After amusing himself with this activity for a while, he headed towards the stables. The wolfhound barked savagely and strained its chain in rage. The professor began pelting the dog's face with pebbles and poked him with a stick he had picked up to tease him. It happened instantly and without warning. The chain broke. Dog and man were rolling in a bundle of the ground. One was roaring in anger and the other screaming in weird sounds. The wolfhound had the professor by the throat and its fangs had bitten deep. The professor had lost consciousness before we reached him to separate him from the enraged animal. Bennett's presence and voice quieted the wolfhound instantly. The uproar had fetched the sleepy and stunned coachman from his room above the stables. I am not surprised, as I have seen him do this before, he declared as he shook his head. I knew the dog would get him some day. We carried the professor to his room where I dressed his torn throat with Bennett's help. I had given the professor a morphia injection and he was sleeping soundly. Holmes inspected the professor's mysterious box, where we found an empty tube and one that was almost full. We also found a hypodermic syringe and many letters in foreign language. One envelope was still unopened and bore the postmark of Prague. We have what we want, Holmes exclaimed and tore open the envelope. It ran, Honored colleague, I have thought about your case a lot after you visited me last. Considering your circumstances, although there are some special reasons for your treatment, I strongly advise you to take precautions. I think that a serum of anthropoid would have possibly been better. As earlier explained to you, I have used black-faced langur simply because a specimen was accessible. Langur is a crawler and a climber, while an anthropoid walks erect. I have another client in England and Dorak is my agent for both. Yours, with high esteem, H. Lonstein. Lonstein? The name immediately brought back a memory of a newspaper article about a mysterious scientist who was trying to discover the secret of youthfulness for old people using some unknown methods. Lowenstein of Prague. In a few words, I told Holmes and Bennett what I recalled. We have traced the source of the evil, thanks to you, Mr. Holmes, Bennett explained. The real source lies in the untimely love affair that gave the professor the notion that his wish could be fulfilled if he could turn himself into a young man. Holmes stated, If man tries to rise above nature, he only falls below it. Holmes sat deep in thoughts for a while, staring at the clear liquid in the tube that he held. Then he spoke. I expect no further trouble once I have written to this man and warned him that he would be arrested if he continues circulating this poison publicly. But it might happen again, as others might find a better way to do this. This is a real threat to humanity. But the case is closed, Mr. Bennett, as the incidents all fit in. The dog was aware of the change more than you purely because of animal instinct. It did not attack the professor but attacked the monkey actually. Similarly, it was not the professor but the monkey that teased the dog. Climbing was pure joy for the creature, and I suspect that it was mere chance that the pastime brought him to the young lady's window. You were listening to The Creeping Man. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, then please subscribe to our channel. Thank you for being a Word Teller listener. We will be back with another audiobook shortly. Until then, happy listening.